I started to get a lot more curious about the history of Baltimore, the history of the Jewish community in Baltimore. And a friend referred me to Deborah Weiner's excellent book on the screen there, On Middle Ground. And I was really fascinated by the book. I really had no idea about how the Jewish community had evolved from colonial times all the way up to modern times. If you have not read her book, please, I urge you to read it. It's a must read for anybody who lives in Baltimore and wants to learn about the history of Baltimore. But it's fascinating to know that there was a completely independent community in East Baltimore and West Baltimore, one German speaking, one Yiddish speaking. So absolutely stunned me, and I had no idea, and it was fascinating learning. Deborah Weiner is a Baltimore-based historian, writer, editor, and curator. She is co-author of the book On Middle Ground, A History of the Jews of Baltimore, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. And she's also author of the book Coalfield Jews, An Appalachian History, published by the University of Illinois Press. For the past decade, Dr. Weiner has served as a consultant to museums, historical societies, and other organizations. Previously, she was a research historian and family history coordinator at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. She has taught public history and American Jewish history at Johns Hopkins University, the University of Baltimore, and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Dr. Weiner earned a PhD in history from West Virginia University and a BA in American Studies from Grinnell College. Originally from Chicago, she worked in the community development field before becoming an historian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Weiner.
So thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate seeing everybody here, and to all the people who are going to be on Zoom, thank you also for tuning in. I wonder how many were intrigued by the title, From Convicts to Congregations. We actually chose that title because we thought it would be, the snappy title to sort of intrigue people. But in actual fact, it is a, It is a quite appropriate title because the very first known Jewish resident of Baltimore was indeed a convicted thief from London named Solomon Gabriel. He was sentenced to servitude in the colonies and arrived here in 1764. And this picture shows a group of convict transports in London who were about to be shipped to America. So how do we know about Gabriel in particular? Well, because he ran away from his masters, causing them to place this ad, and sort of describes all about him. So from this rather dubious beginning grew the Baltimore Jewish community. So what I'm going to do is present a sort of a broad survey that goes back 250 years. So the Jewish community, or Jewish Baltimore, is 250 years old. And basically hit the highlights. It's going to be sort of broad rather than going in depth on any particular topic. So later when when we have a chance for questions, you can bring some things up. So about a decade after Gabriel ran away, we see the beginnings of a Jewish community when Baltimore started to grow as a trading center just before the American Revolution. And this is from around 1800, I believe. It's one of the earlier pictures that we have of Baltimore. So this growth attracted Jewish entrepreneurs who began to settle down, put down roots, like the Edding family. Their family cemetery at North Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue, which remains today, is one of the oldest remnants of the Jewish community that we have. And here's a picture of Solomon Edding. The Eddings and the Cohen family became the two prominent Jewish families of early Baltimore. They were involved in all kinds of civic enterprises, for example, starting the water company and investing in the B&O Railroad. And Jacob Cohen actually ran a lottery, which, believe it or not, was one way that the city funded its operations way back then. And their activities sort of set the pattern for Jewish civic involvement, which is one of the themes of my book, really, is the involvement of Jews in the development of Baltimore, and something that I'll be touching on throughout this talk. Two Cohens and an Edding were actually among the American forces at the Battle of Fort McHenry, famous for the Star-Spangled Banner, as you probably know. And there are actually stories about how kosher food was brought to them at the fort during the time that their militia was stationed there. So, but there was one thing that Jews in this early period were actually barred from doing, and that was from holding public office in Maryland, because there was a requirement that to hold public office, you had to swear an oath, a Christian oath, on the Bible. And after a 20-year fight, the state legislature finally passed something known as the Jew Bill in 1826, which allowed Jews to substitute a declaration of belief in a creator, so they wouldn't have to swear to Jesus Christ. And immediately afterwards, Solomon Edding and Jacob Cohen were both elected to the Baltimore City Council. And this is another theme that sort of goes through Baltimore history, is that Jews really found acceptance and were able to contribute very much to Baltimore, but there were always limits in some way. Things that they had to fight, issues that they had to fight. So it was kind of a mixture. Now in 1820, there were only around 120 Jews in Baltimore. Most were not like the Eddings and Cohens, well-to-do and very involved. They were mostly peddlers and small traders and sort of scraping by, many of them. But then a mass migration of Germans to America happened from the 1820s to the 1870s. And this was a migration of both Jews and non-Jews. So Baltimore became quite a German town. I think at one point, about a quarter of the city's residents were actually German immigrants or children of German immigrants. The reason being that there was a lot of political and economic turmoil going on in Germany, but also Jews had an additional reason to emigrate, which was that they were discriminated against very much in Germany. So they were part of this wave of German immigrants, and this is considered the first great wave of Jewish immigration to Baltimore. And finally, enough Jews gathered. Let's see here. So in those days, they came on a sailing ship. The trip wasn't, it took a long time before steamships. It was kind of a harrowing experience. So it's kind of amazing that so many people actually came to this country. So finally, enough Jews came to form a congregation. And the congregation that they formed, the very first in Maryland, was the Baltimore Hebrew congregation. And this was where one of their first meeting places. It's a picture from the 1920s, which is the oldest we have. It was, they met in rented rooms on Bond and Fleet Streets in what is today Fells Point. And in 1840, they hired the first rabbi to come to America, and that was Rabbi Abraham Rice, who was from Bavaria. Before then, the congregations in America were basically led by lay leaders. They didn't have any ordained rabbis.
Can you hold on 1 second? We lost our connection.
Oh, okay. We're back?
Yeah, we're back.
Okay, so this is Rabbi Abraham Rice, who was the first rabbi to come to America, the first ordained rabbi ordained in Germany, and he came to Baltimore. And he was actually important nationally to Jews around the country because he was seen as an authority that that American Jewry had lacked. So he would get letters from all over the country asking questions about kashrut or about working on the Sabbath, or a whole bunch of questions that he answered. He was sort of considered himself, I think, America's rabbi for a while. And the fact that Baltimore had Baltimore was the city to have the first rabbi was sort of an example of Baltimore's importance as a congregation within American Jewry. And this is just one first that Baltimore is going to go on to have. So the congregation built Lloyd Street Synagogue in 1845, which was the first synagogue in Maryland, and today the third oldest surviving synagogue building in the US. And if anybody hasn't gone down to see it down on Lloyd Street, you definitely should go. And it's part of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and you can take a tour. But even though they had a rabbi and they had a beautiful congregation synagogue, not all was going smoothly for the congregation. And because they were caught up in the conflict that was raging among American Jews then, and I don't think this conflict has exactly stopped, which was how much to hold on to tradition versus how much to modernize and how much to Americanize. So this time of the mid-19th century was really the rise of Reform Judaism, which had a lot of adherents in America, but also a lot of critics. So this is another theme that runs through Middle Ground through our book, which is sort of how do you balance being American and being Jewish? And Baltimore is kind of an excellent case study through the years of how people have done this. So to some people back in the 1840s, Baltimore Hebrew was too traditional for them. And after feuding with Rabbi Rice, a group broke away to form Har Sinai, and that was in 1842. So Har Sinai was actually the first congregation in America created specifically as a Reform congregation. There were earlier congregations that had become Reform, but they weren't built, they had moved from Orthodoxy to Reform. But Har Sinai was the first started as a Reform congregation. So they left, but even then, to Rabbi Rice, Baltimore Hebrew was not traditional enough. So he ends up resigning in 1849. And he writes a famous letter to his mentor in Germany, which is in every book on American Jewish history you could ever read, lamenting that Jews in America routinely violate the Sabbath, eat non-kosher food, and intermarry with non-Jews. And he says, "My mind is perplexed, and I wonder whether it is even permissible for a Jew to live in this land." And to this day, he's sort of a hero to Orthodox Jews who know about American history. And they even make, there's people who make a pilgrimage to his grave every year on the date of his yahrzeit. And his grave, by the way, is in the Baltimore Hebrew Cemetery on Bel Air Road in Baltimore. So this conflict over tradition versus reform continued at Baltimore Hebrew for the next 30 years and results in the spinoff of 3 more congregations, all of which still exist in some form today. And that would be the Orthodox Shereth Israel, shown here from their 1920s building, Glen Avenue Shul, which the congregation was actually started by Rice himself in 1851. And Oheb Shalom was founded in the 1850s by people who were sick of all the fighting that was going on at Baltimore Hebrew. And that's why they have the name Shalom, peace, in the title of their congregation. So finally, in the 1870s, the remaining Orthodox gave up on Baltimore Hebrew, which was, they thought, becoming too reform, and they all left to form Hizuk Amunah, which at the time they formed it as an Orthodox congregation. And this is their original building, which is on Lloyd Street, just a few doors down from the Lloyd Street Synagogue, which is today occupied by the B'nai Israel congregation. This is another theme, is sort of the continuity of Jewish institutions. Even though there's been lots of change, the roots go way back. So many congregations dating from these early periods and institutions as well. And by the way, the reason that the folks from Hizuk finally left Baltimore Hebrew, what the final straw was that Baltimore Hebrew instituted a mixed choir of men and women, and that was just too much for them. So the Jews of the mid-19th century were divided not only by religion, but by politics as well. And in fact, the Civil War divided Baltimore Jewry, just as it did Baltimoreans generally. And that leads to another theme, which is Baltimore's position as a border city, not quite northern and not quite southern. And so, of course, it had more conflict during the Civil War over people having allegiances one way or the other, although most Baltimoreans tended to side with the South, Jews and non-Jews. The clearest, this slide shows Rabbi David Einhorn on the left, who of Har Sinai. He was an abolitionist, and his newspaper, he had an abolitionist newspaper, which was actually destroyed by a pro-slavery mob, and he and his family had to flee to Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Rabbi Illowy of Baltimore Hebrew, shown on the right, he gave a sermon defending slavery. So just as an example of how divided Baltimore was. Here's two more men who show the same thing. Leopold Blumenberg was a major in the Union's 5th Maryland Regiment, wounded and at Antietam. But his good friend, merchant Moses Wiesenfeld, was actually convicted of selling goods to the Confederacy. So here's our second convict, in case you were wondering if there were any more were going to show up. And here's Wiesenfeld's store, you can see on the left. He was quite a prominent merchant. And I just wanted to say a word about the economic life of Jews in the 19th century. All immigrants, no matter where they're from, build on their past experiences when they come to their new country. And in Europe, Jews had been restricted to certain economic areas. In trade, they were restricted to trade. They were in the garment industry. So all this actually positioned them to achieve success in America, which was growing rapidly. There was a lot of commerce going on and new technologies. For example, the sewing machine was invented in the 1840s, which allowed for the rise of the clothing industry, just at the same time that all these German Jews were coming into the country. And in Baltimore, the completion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1853 expanded the market for Baltimore goods and made business a very good, it's very good for Baltimore in terms of business. So German Jews start small clothing factories that grow into a sizable garment industry. And it will actually become Baltimore's largest industry until it's surpassed by the steel industry during World War I. And this picture shows Henry Sonneborn's factory. He had actually the largest men's clothing factory in the world at Paca and Pratt Streets, and this picture is from 1905. So second is retailing. In the 1850s, a retail center started to emerge along Howard Street with dozens of small dry goods dealers, many of whom were Jewish. And this will become the center of the downtown shopping district by the 1880s, which is the beginning of the era of the grand department store. And now most of these department stores were owned by Jews. Gutman's was the first. Of course, there was Hutzler's, and this is Hochschild Cohn's at Howard and Lexington around 1903. And there was Heck's and a few others. So on the whole, the Jews in the mid-19th century tended to prosper. And they started to leave their residential areas near downtown and move into the Utah Place area, a much more fashionable area. And so this is the beginning of the great migration to Northwest Baltimore that will continue for the next 100 years plus and really never stopped, right? In this area, in the Utah Place area, they built grand synagogues. This is Ohab Shalom's temple, referred to as the Utah Place Temple. And today it still exists, and it's an African-American Masonic hall. And in fact, many landmarks of Jewish Baltimore still exist today and have been repurposed for other uses. And here's a confirmation class at Ohab Shalom. showing basically a very American-looking group of kids and their rabbi.
Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
Just keep losing my connection.
Can everybody hear me okay? I might as well.
Yeah.
I'm gonna see if I sit over here.
Are we back on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So by the end of the 19th century, these German Jews have basically pretty much assimilated into American life and become American Jews. And they continue to play an important role in civic life. For example, in 1904, Isidore Weiner is elected as the first Jewish US Senator from Maryland, only up until Ben Cardin, I believe. And he serves 2 terms in the Senate. But at the same time that this first migration wave is sort of moving up in the world, a new and much larger wave of Jewish immigrants are about to arrive. And I want you just to note the contrast between that gentleman, that family, the Reinhardt family, and the family that I'll show you coming up. So the Great Migration of Eastern European Jews to America started in the 1880s. And the Jewish population of Baltimore actually more than doubled between 1880 and 1890, from 10,000 to 24,000. And here's a more sort of a typical Eastern European Jewish family, a little bit different from the last Jewish family you saw. This is the Rodbell family. If you look at the girl at the top in the center with the X above her head, that is Dora Rodbell, who will become Dora Rodbell. Anybody know? Dora Rodbell Silber of Silber's Bakery. And this is her family when, in Baltimore, she arrived as a younger child. And her father actually was a baker as well. The Rodbells and the other Eastern European Jews settled in East Baltimore. And they create, a Jewish enclave where Yiddish is the main language. It was mostly Jewish, but there were also other people living there too. So this map sort of shows, you can see the blue residences are Jews, the red ones are Italians, and then there's a kind of a light purple color, which are African Americans. So those were the 3 main groups living in this neighborhood around Lombard Street. And basically it was a slum with overcrowding, poverty, disease, and people underwent great hardships when they first came to this country. Many found work in the clothing factories at the garment district on the west side, or in sweatshops like this one on the east side, which were often located in apartments. So but despite these hardships, the immigrants create a vibrant culture centered around the Lombard Street market area. It's sort of a mini Lower East Side with shops and shochets, study halls, and synagogues. And the synagogues were often based on Old Town origins. So for example,
1 second.
okay. We're back?
Yeah.
Okay, so this synagogue was called Anshe Bobroisk because it was for people from the town of Bobroisk, which is in Belarus. And eventually actually merged with other synagogues and became part of what is today Ner Tamid. So in addition to religious life and social life, there were Yiddish theater, clubs, Workman's Circle had a very strong chapter. So it was really a bustling neighborhood, the East Baltimore, Lombard Street. They formed garment unions.
Hold on a second. I have to do this differently next time. My computer keeps losing the connection, so they lose the screen share, then I have to And they can't see the slides.
Right.
They can see you, but not the slides.
Oh,
So next time slides are shared with somebody with just a perfect Wi-Fi connection. Okay, go ahead.
so what was I talking about? Garment union. And so Jews, because the garment industry was the largest industry, Jews come to play a major role in the labor movement in Baltimore. And who was their labor conflict with? The owners of the factories, who were Jews, originally German Jews. So this highlights the conflict in the Jewish community, which lasted for quite a long time, of sort of the German Jews versus the Russian Jews. It was economic, it was religious also, because the East Europeans tended to remain Orthodox while the Germans were to reform, and also social tensions and class tensions. So now German Jews did provide quite a bit of charitable support for the immigrants that immigrants benefited from when they first came. But the immigrants also started their own charities because they didn't want to rely on the established Jews. And this picture is the Hebrew Friendly Inn. You can see it's not the most beautiful building in the world, but it was their first sort of helped transients and then helped old people, and eventually became Levendale. So yeah, this was the part of the origins of Levendale, was this building right here on Lombard Street. And so these different sets of charities, the German Jewish charities and the Russian Jewish charities, finally combined into the Associated Jewish Charities in 1920, when relations between the two groups started to improve. But even before that, there were some German Jews and East European Jews who worked together to improve conditions for the immigrants. And Henrietta Zold was one of them. She got her start, and she was the daughter of a prominent rabbi, Benjamin Zold of Ohad Shalom, but she worked with the Eastern Europeans to start a night school for the immigrants. And of course, she goes on to found Hadassah, and later goes to Palestine and builds, as you probably all know, what will become basically the healthcare infrastructure of Israel. And so here she is on Israeli currency. So maybe the most important institution created to help the immigrants was the Jewish Educational Alliance, which was trying to keep youth off the street because there was a lot of temptation to crime and that sort of thing. And then they also had night classes for adults and all kinds of activities. So there was the boys, and now you get the girls. And the Jewish Educational Alliance eventually becomes the JCC, right? So there are a lot of institutions, as I said, in East Baltimore that are still around today, but with new names. So for example, Hebrew Hospital on East Monument Street is today's Sinai Hospital. So eventually the Russian Jews begin to get ahead, like the Germans before them, mostly through being small shopkeepers and opening small family businesses. And women were also almost always critical in these businesses. They were true family businesses with the wives and husbands working together, and children also, which I think the picture before had a daughter working at the counter. So the immigrants start to, by the 1920s, start to come up themselves, aided again by an America that is growing and the economy is growing. I do want to just mention the two most prominent East European Jews of Baltimore. One is the Lithuanian immigrant, Jacob Epstein, who started the Baltimore Bargain House as a teenager. And it grows into one of the nation's largest wholesale houses. And he later becomes a driving force behind the Associated and behind the Baltimore Museum of Art, and as well as a major civic leader. And this is his portrait. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It hangs in the Baltimore Museum of Art, which he donated his collection to. And this in the center here is Jacob Blaustein. He and his father, Louis, began selling kerosene door to door, and eventually their company grew into the American Oil Company, or Amoco, one of the nation's largest oil companies. And his name, the name of Blaustein, lives on today largely through the foundation, the Blaustein Foundation. But also he was a very important national Jewish leader, the first Eastern European Jew to become the head of the American Jewish Committee, for example. And here he is shown with Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir. So, but people who made important contributions in the early 20th century were not just wealthy and not just men. Many other Jews made their mark on the local and national stage. This woman is Bessie Moses, a little less well known. She was an early female physician who founded Baltimore's first birth control clinic in 1927. And she was a leading national advocate for birth control and a major player in the founding of Planned Parenthood. So in 1920, we have about 65,000 Jews living in Baltimore. And the early 20s see that very end of mass migration due to federal quotas that are placed. Now, no longer can everybody just come to America. They're definitely limiting the number of people who could come, and anti-Semitism played a role in that because they target Southern and Eastern Europe for getting, you know, the smallest quotas of people who can arrive. So what this means for the Jewish community, it's that there's not going to be a lot of replacement. There was a constant amount of immigrants coming in for about 100 years, and that's going to end. You see the growth really of an American Jewish culture as opposed to an immigrant Jewish culture. And the Eastern European Jews start to leave East Baltimore, and where they move to Northwest Baltimore and form new Jewish neighborhoods. This is Park Heights with the streetcar, and they moved to Lower Park Heights, Druid Hill Park, and Forest Park. And so you see during the sort of interwar period between the two, you know, between World War I and World War II, you have this American Jewish culture growing up, and families are Americanizing. Now, the Depression came along, and that was a major setback for many families, but it proved temporary, really, for the most part, for the Jewish community as a whole. The 1920s and 30s, as I noted when I talked about the quotas, it really is kind of the height of anti-Semitism in American history. Jews were restricted to certain areas, which is why you see all the Jews, part of the reason that Jews are concentrated in Northwest Baltimore. You can see from this ad, Roland Park in Guilford, 1,000 acres of restricted land. And that's a lot of acres. The Roland Park Company actually owned different neighborhoods. They developed different neighborhoods around North Baltimore, not just Roland Park. And none of them would accept Jews. So that's a pretty strong reason for Jews to be sort of more concentrated. And then beaches and swim clubs had restrictions. Meadowbrook, ironically, Mount Washington had many Jews living there. So you can imagine that this was a sign that they were not happy to see. But again, ironically, by helping to concentrate the Jewish population, this kind of discrimination helped increase Jewish voting power, leading to the rise of Jewish politicians. And does anybody know who the gentleman on the right is? Jack Pollock, right. And he became really the most important sort of behind the scenes politician in Baltimore in the 30s, 40s, into the 50s. And he started out as a bootlegger, but never got caught. If he had, he would be the third convict on the but he never did. So instead, he became a powerful politician with his ruthless brand of machine politics and an embarrassment to a certain portion of the Jewish population at the time. And indeed, I found a document in the Baltimore Jewish Council archives saying it was like 8 embarrassing things about Jack Pollock. And it was written at the time and went on to list all the things that they thought made Jack Pollock sort of bad for the Jews. Jewish neighborhoods, as I said, Druid Hill Park, this is Sherry Tefillah, partly formed from discrimination, but partly by choice as well, especially Orthodox neighborhoods. People want to live within walking distance of their shul. So that, of course, will lend itself to concentration. And we have new synagogues through the 1920s as Eastern European Jews move out of East Baltimore, or they pretty much moved by the 1920s and 30s. And this is when in my opinion, the Jewish community really becomes a tight-knit community, because basically all the Jews are living in one section. The Germans, the Russians, it doesn't mean they get along, but they're all living in close quarters. 1933, we have the founding of Ner Israel by Jacob Ruderman. And it quickly acquires a national reputation and remains an important Orthodox seminary to this day. And I think it's because of Ner Israel, Baltimore develops other strong Orthodox institutions. And I think this is the key reason that Baltimore is going to attract a large Orthodox population in later years. Also in 1933, of course, this is when Adolf Hitler comes to power in Germany and Jews start to leave. But it was much harder to come to the US than it had been before because of immigration restrictions. Nevertheless, around 3,000 German Jewish refugees settled in Baltimore between 1933 and 41, aided by individual Baltimoreans who had to sponsor them, as well as the city's organized Jewish community, which helped them resettle. Groups like Hayas and the Associated started a special committee for the refugees, and the National Council of Jewish Women, the Baltimore branch, was very involved in helping the refugees settle. So among the refugees to Baltimore are spice maker Gustav Brunn and his family, who arrived in 1938 after enduring Kristallnacht. And I'm sure this won't be a surprise to many of you that Brunn starts a spice company and has great success with a seasoning that he invents around 1941 that he calls Old Bay, which today seems to be more popular than ever. It's in the news all the time. And then after the war, Holocaust survivors start arriving in Baltimore, again, helped by the Jewish community, the Associated and its agencies. So even though the two great large immigration waves ended, Baltimore Jews, the community experienced smaller waves that have continued to impact the community and add to the diversity of Baltimore's Jewish community. So now we're finally got to World War II. After World War II, we have suburbanization of America, and a new generation of Baltimore Jewry continues to move north and west, from Lower Park Heights to Upper Park Heights, from Forest Park to Randallstown, Pikesville, and lots of young Jewish families are actually choosing Randallstown. And the first synagogue to be built in Randallstown to serve these young families was Beth Israel. It started out in a farmhouse, a converted farmhouse, and then they built a synagogue. And you can see this slide shows the effort to build the synagogue that they had in Randallstown before moving out here. And it was really a rare sort of conservative alternative for Baltimore Jews. Unlike most cities, Baltimore didn't develop a huge conservative population with a lot of conservative synagogues. And I think that can be attributed to the fact that Orthodoxy remains so strong, including modern Orthodoxy. So, but Beth Israel was possibly the second, well, actually third conservative congregation, because by that time, Hizgamuno had moved from Orthodoxy to conservative. And then there was Bethel. So they were sort of the three leading conservative congregations, and that all sort of developed in the post-war period. Now, Jewish real estate developers were very involved in shaping Baltimore and its development in the decades after World War II. Joseph Meyerhoff being the most prominent, building subdivision shopping centers. He actually pioneered in the suburban style shopping center. but today is more famous for his philanthropy with Meyerhoff Symphony Hall, which opened in 1982. So now we're up to the 1960s, where there's really a lessening of anti-Semitism, and Jews are more mainstream, and Jewish elected officials break out beyond the Jewish neighborhoods. And Baltimore native Marvin Mandel becomes the first Jewish governor of Maryland. The woman at the top left, does anybody know who that is? No, actually, it's Rosalie Silver Abrams. And standing next to her, shaking Mandel's hand, is none other than Dora Silver, her mother, Rosalie's mother. And Rosalie became a very groundbreaking woman politician in Maryland, the first woman to head the Democratic Party. She was a legislator for many years. And she was the daughter of the Silver's Bakery folks. So Jews really sort of established themselves politically during this period. The 1960s was also the civil rights era, and Jews were very much involved. One Black leader estimated that of 2/3 of the white participants in the civil rights movement were Jewish, according to one Black leader. And rabbis played a prominent role. This picture shows Israel Goldman of Issachamuno, Rabbi Israel Goldman, being fingerprinted after being arrested at a demonstration to integrate Gwynn Oak Park. It was a famous demonstration, and people did civil disobedience and got arrested. So Issachamuno's congregants were not really sure how they felt about seeing their rabbi fingerprinted on the pages of the Sun, but then they started receiving all kinds of letters of support, and then they decided they were proud. But Jews were not just participants in the civil rights movement, they were also targets of the civil rights movement. And that's partly because of the Jim Crow policies of the downtown department stores, which didn't allow Blacks to try on clothes, didn't allow Blacks to eat in the lunch counter, and basically made them feel very unwelcome. And there were pickets and all kinds of things. And finally, in 1960, Hochul Cohn was the first to change its policies and allow Blacks to have equal rights in the stores. And I chose this picture because the person in front is Walter Sondheim, and he kind of shows both sides of the equation, because as president of the school board, where he's pictured here, he was very supportive of desegregation, and in 1954 led the school board to become unanimous in voting to desegregate Baltimore's public schools. But he was also a top executive at Hochul Cohn, and it wasn't until 6 years later that his own department stores finally stopped discriminating. So in a way, you have Jews sort of on both sides, kind of like the Civil War. So again, sort of a north of Baltimore being a border city had a lot to do with this. Now the department store owners were afraid to desegregate because they felt that they would lose all their white customers. But the NAACP didn't think that this was a very good excuse. And finally, they managed to desegregate. So, and that, of course, had a major impact on the rest of Baltimore, showing again the Jewish impact and contributions to the city. Jews also had a major impact on Baltimore's cultural scene. In 1949, Etta Cohn gave the Baltimore Museum of Art its the sister's collection that she and her sister had collected of modern art, including Matisse's especially, which is, here's a Matisse that is part of the Cohn collection, that they had gathered in Paris with the help of their close friend Gertrude Stein, who lived in Baltimore for a few years after she and her brother were orphaned. She was a teenager. She moved to Baltimore to live with relatives before going on to become a famous sort of modernist in Paris. And she got to know the Cohn sisters very well. So the cultural impact of Baltimore Jews goes beyond the local to the national. And I thought I'd include these two slides here. The woman on the left, Ellen Naomi Cohen from Baltimore, achieved fame as Mama Cass Elliott of the Mamas and the Papas. And a classmate of hers at Forest Park High School, Barry Levinson, released the movie Diner in 1982, the first of several nationally popular movies that he will make chronicling Baltimore Jewish life. So to conclude, the three latest small waves of Jewish migration to Baltimore should be mentioned. Iranian Jews arrived after the Iranian Revolution in 1978. Largely, Ner Israel Seminary had a lot to do with this because they brought a lot of rabbinical students from Iran. And Soviet Jews, of course, arrived from Russia, and a trend that continued in the post-communist era. And there was also, of course, the internal migration of Orthodox Jews from New York, which gave Baltimore really the largest percentage of Orthodox Jews of any city in America. It's sort of neck and neck with New York. And so, of course, we have the largest kosher supermarket in the country. Today, there's about 95,000 Jews in greater Baltimore, or 3 to 4% of the population. And it's a diverse Jewish community, which can be seen in Synagogue Row along Park Heights, starting with, this is the Iranian synagogue, or Hamizrach, and goes from Orthodox to Reform. And I thought I would end with the congregation I started out with, also on Park Heights Avenue, Baltimore Hebrew. I thought it would be better to end with congregations and not with convicts. Hopefully, we don't have quite so many anymore. So, thank you. So now I guess we'll take questions from.
Yeah, and
Zoom or
if you're online and you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat.
There's a question here.
Yes, my parents are lifelong Baltimoreans, and my father grew up in East Baltimore, but my mother grew up in West Baltimore, and she thinks that was the best place in the entire world.
Right.
So why is that not included in the?
That's a good question. The point was that although many Jews in East Baltimore, there were many Jews in East Baltimore, there was also an immigrant Jewish community in West Baltimore that your mother lived in. And that is very true. It was smaller. It was located around the garment factories that were in West Baltimore. Yes, it was a vibrant immigrant community, and it's only left out because of time.
It's included in the book.
It's in the book, yes, it is in the book. But I think, you know, it was much smaller than East Baltimore. It had maybe 3 or 4 synagogues, or maybe small synagogues. And eventually they too joined with the East Baltimoreans to start moving northwest. But yes, there was an immigrant Jewish community in West Baltimore as well. Anybody else?
Are there any questions? Can you see the chat?
I am looking in the chat, do not have any yet. When did, 2 questions. When did the garment factories end?
When did the garment factories end is the question. Really, they sort of petered out after the 1930s or changed ownership. Partly, they were extremely anti-union, and once the unions came in, a lot of them just started to shut down. But also there was, you know, economic changes. There was the Depression. Some of them stayed going. One factory was Israel Meyer's London Fog, which continued, you know, into the 1950s and 60s. Most of the big ones that were earlier had shut down by then, and with London Fog, they did what all factories started to do in the 1960s and 70s, which was move to the South or move overseas.
We had another question. Only one convict was mentioned. Who were the others?
Well, actually, I mentioned Wiesenfeld and I mentioned Solomon Gabriel. There is some attention devoted in the book to Jewish criminals in the 1930s and 40s. They were gamblers. Jews were big time gamblers. They were an integral part of the underworld in Baltimore, in gambling and even bootlegging. And like I said, Jack Pollock may not have been caught, but others were. And it's fun to read I was reading, you read the Baltimore Sun in the 1930s. There are these articles about raids on, say, a small Jewish restaurant where they go in the back and they find people frantically pouring liquor down the drain. So there were lots of there were other Jewish convicts, but again, just due to time constraints, I didn't think that they in a 45-minute talk they probably don't deserve too much attention, but you could definitely read about them.
I have one other question.
Yeah.
This is really going to test your trivia knowledge.
Uh-oh.
Was the hat factory near the University of Maryland Hospital started by a Jewish person?
Well, if the question is, was a hat factory started by a Jewish person? If they're referring to, you mean a current hat factory? If it's a current, I would say probably not. But there was a very famous, the Levy Straw Hat Factory was one of the biggest Baltimore businesses. So I'm not sure where it was located, but all the garment factories were pretty much around that area. And the straw hats would sort of qualify as part of that industry. Whether it's a current one, my guess would be not. Yeah.
You touched upon the Roland Park Company having restricted home. Wasn't that owned by a prominent Jew?
The question was whether the Roland Park Company was owned by a prominent Jew. No, it wasn't. It was owned by a guy named Edward Bouton, not sure how you pronounce it. But the Meyerhoffs played a role in the Roland Park Company. During the Depression, well, the Roland Park Company started in the 1890s with this guy, Bouton. And he wanted to restrict Jews basically for financial reasons. He wanted it to be exclusive. And they would not sell to Jewish people. But the company got into trouble in the 1930s, like many companies, because of the Depression. And he ended up sort of joining forces with Joseph Meyerhoff, which did not end, the practices of Meyerhoff went along with it. And in fact, other Jewish real estate owners did discriminate against Jews in some of their buildings. For example, one example was the Maryland Apartments, which is in University Parkway. And the Baltimore Jewish Council attempted, when they were working on fighting residential discrimination, they thought, well, we'll start with the Jewish developers because we'll just put some pressure on them and they'll start renting to their fellow Jews or selling. And they couldn't get them to do it. So they had to abandon that tactic and fight, so their first targeted success was not a Jewish developer. That's very good. Anything else?
I lost my connection.
Oh.
There were 3 large modern Orthodox synagogues. It was Rogers Avenue Synagogue, Beth Jacob Synagogue, and Beth Tefillah. Now they've all merged into Beth Tefillah, but at one time, those were the 3 largest Orthodox synagogues.
Right. Yeah. The point was that there were 3 large modern Orthodox synagogues: Beth Jacob, Beth Tefillah, and what was the third one? Rogers Avenue. Right. And I think, again, what I touched on a little bit was that I think that's one reason why there weren't very many conservative synagogues in Baltimore, was because the modern Orthodox were so strong. Now, it was interesting. There were a lot of internal struggles in some of these. Beth Tefillah there was a movement at Beth Tefillah to become a conservative synagogue. in the 1940s. And actually the board voted for Beth DeFilla to become conservative, and then the membership got very angry about this and they didn't become conservative. So yes, I think it's managed to kind of walk a fine line for not just recently, but for decades. And like I said, the other modern Orthodox larger ones ended up merging with Beth DeFilla, so it became more difficult to sustain, I think, with the rise of Orthodoxy, really moving away from modern Orthodoxy to more strict observance.
What about hospitals?
Hospitals, the first, Hebrew hospital was founded on East Monument Street. And it was going pretty strong. I think it was founded in the 1920s and didn't move up to northwest Baltimore, didn't move up to become Sinai until 1959. Pardon?
It was Sinai downtown.
Well, yes, Hebrew, yes. First it was called Hebrew Hospital, and then it changed its name to Sinai. But we're talking about the same on East Monument Street, and then moved up to Dear Leavenworth. That's the only Jewish hospital really that I know of, but it had its roots in East Baltimore and then moved. Did you have another?
You already answered.
Okay.
Now we're doing text message questions.
Oh, okay.
that Becca's sending me because I lost my connection. That's all.
Anything else?
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.